agree to the extent that there are periods in history when countries and populations become gloomy and sad and despairing and hopeless. I'm not sure that it reaches the level of being called a psychiatric disorder. I wouldn't want to medicalise these very appropriate social responses to certain circumstances. At the moment, I think there is a lot of gloom and doom about. There's the gloom of the recession in the economy. There's been the awfulness of all the sexual abuse by clerics that's ongoing. So those two factors, and the long winter. So, there have been a number of issues that have impinged on our national mood. But what we see as a result of that is not an increase in disorder so much as people trying to harm themselves on a once-off because they feel gloomy and see no way out, but not because they have disorders. It's just because their circumstances have changed. Perhaps people have lost money or people have lost jobs, and they react with low mood and then often self-harm. And we certainly get a lot more people now coming in having attempted suicide as a result of what's going on, as a result of the recession and being out of work and having a huge drop, experiencing a huge drop in income.
You mentioned sort of clerical abuse there as having been something that we've all heard an awful lot about in the media. I don't want to focus on clerical abuse, but child sexual abuse is something I know that you've worked with. And we were talking before about just how incredibly serious this is and what kind of an impact this can have on somebody's life, how it can really affect and alter the trajectory of their lives. How would you as a professional begin to treat or begin to help somebody who has had that experience?
Many people who are sexually abused, firstly, they need quite intensive psychotherapy to come to terms with the breach of trust. It will always have been, or invariably have been, an adult in a position of trust. Most commonly, a parent, a father, or a stepfather, but somebody in a position of trust, and the breach the breach in trust that has led to that can devastate a person's sense of safety. The world is supposed to be a safe place. Your home is supposed to be a safe place when you're a child, and if it isn't, that can alter people's sense of what is safe anyway, who can be trusted. So it can affect interpersonal relationships because they don't trust people. We know from vast amounts of research that sexual abuse is associated with self-harm, and people who repeatedly self-harm often have a history of abuse. And the explanation they give for the self-harm is that when they are abused as children, they often become numb. They sort of numb themselves to the emotional and physical pain of whether it's being beaten or being sexually molested. But they go into a state of numbness. And that state can last. And so they cut themselves simply to feel pain because it makes them feel real, it makes them feel human again. And that's why they repeatedly do it, because for them, pain is better than numbness. And I think that's a deeply sad thing to hear. But the effects of sexual abuse are very devastating on people. There's the repeated self-harm, there's depression, suicide, and interpersonal relationships. And children who are sexually abused often themselves become sexualized at a much earlier age. They become sexually active at a much earlier age and become vulnerable to being abused in those adolescent and adult relationships. They will often describe being raped because they're not able to protect themselves. They haven't acquired the skills to protect themselves because of what they've experienced before. So it has to be taken extremely seriously. Bullying of children is also, I'm learning, very disturbing and can cause long-term problems with anxiety and depression and low self-esteem.
And again, we went through a series of fairly high-profile bullying cases in our schools here over the last few years, and there's been one in the media very recently
in America.
Yeah. It seems to be an issue that our schools are still sort of trying to get a real handle on. It's so insidious. It happens when the eyes of teachers and adults are turned away, or sometimes it happens under their noses in ways that they can't quite understand or comprehend. I mean, how do we grasp, or how do we try and address that? I mean, many of our students are going to be working in youth clubs or as teachers' assistants in schools, and this is something that they need to get a handle on too.
Yes, I mean, I think the case in America was particularly difficult because it was happening literally under the teachers' noses. It was happening in the library, it was happening in corridors, and it seems the teachers just either couldn't act or didn't act. I think I read somewhere that there was some legal rule that they couldn't exclude some of the bullies from school under law. They couldn't expel them because they were afraid of litigation from the parents. I think, though, I mean, teachers and parents have to work in this together. And I presume the problem that teachers have is that parents will often not believe that their child is a bully.
You don't want to believe that of your child,
You don't want to believe it. And so that's often a problem, I think. But I think with good teacher-parent relationships and with good, strong boards of management, there should be very firm policies in place. But ultimately, when children are out of the school campus, there's very little.
There's not a whole lot the teachers.
There's not a whole lot the teachers can do. It then transfers to other agencies, mainly parents, I think. And I think parents should be aware that their children aren't always little angels. You know, you might think they are, but they're not always.
It's kind of it is the sort of Lord of the Flies type mentality sometimes, isn't it? It's survival of the fittest.
It can be absolutely. It can be very demeaning, and there can be physical aggression, and
sometimes the psychological aggression is worse.
Absolutely. I mean, I dealt with a case. This was an adult case just a few months ago. It wasn't somebody I was treating, but he was taking a legal case against his employers, and this young man, and he's about 22, and it was his mother persuaded him to take the case, but he worked for a particular organisation, and he'd always been a shy, quiet, gentle boy, and he went to work for this organisation as a storeman or something of that sort, and he was unmercifully abused by his peers. He was about 19 when he started work. Things like locking him in the boot of a car and leaving him there for 5 hours, putting him into a rubbish bin one day and putting blocks on top and then setting fire to it. It was absolutely awful. And he eventually, he told his mother, who went to the employers, and HR did nothing. And then he eventually left work. He couldn't cope with it any longer, as you can imagine, and took a case on his mother's advice against the company. And interestingly, he had seen a psychiatrist who said there was nothing the matter with him except his own sensitive personality. And the barrister in the case thought, this is ridiculous. And he asked me, would I see him, because he's a friend of mine, the barrister was. So I saw this man, and it was dreadful what had happened. And he no more was a sensitive. I mean, of course he was sensitive with how he had been treated, but he was a very nice bloke who had been physically tortured. So he got a very nice sum of money, I am pleased to say, and I think the company went bust as a result, and that gave me even greater pleasure, because they had done nothing. They had done nothing to help this man, or to stop this terrible thing.
It's hard not to take getting locked in a trunk for 5 hours, personally, I think.
There are good sides to psychiatry.
Obviously, yes.
I don't want your students going away thinking that it's all like this all the time. It's not.
Well, I was going to say,